I'm Mike Kistler. I'm here with Safia to talk to you about a new feature that we have coming in .NET 9, OpenAPI document generation, and we hope that you'll think it is happily ever after. My name's Mike Kistler. I'm a principal program manager in the ASP.NET organization. I've been involved in OpenAPI for many years and recently joined the OpenAPI Technical Steering Committee.
And I'm Safia Abdallah. I'm a software engineer on the ASP.NET Core team.
All right, so here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with a slide that just goes through the very highlights of what we're introducing for OpenAPI document generation in .NET 9. And then we're going to jump into a bunch of demos. I'm going to start by demoing how you generate OpenAPI documents, how you can view that generated document in a UI, and then how you can also generate your OpenAPI documents at build time. Then I'll go on to show how you can add rich metadata like descriptions and tags and summaries to all of your program elements so that your OpenAPI document is very rich and provides users with all the information that they need. And then the last thing that I'll do is I'll show you how you can take that generated OpenAPI document and use it in your local development tooling. In particular, I'll show how you can use OpenAPI linters to check for specific patterns in your OpenAPI. And we'll actually see that there's still some problems, and that's where Safia will come in.
Yeah. Awesome. And after that, we'll wrap up and take some questions from the audience.
All right, so to start, we're introducing OpenAPI document generation in .NET 9. And this is going to be a feature that's available for both minimal APIs and for controller-based APIs.
And one of the great things about this new support is that we're continuing the trend that we picked up in .NET 8, which is this built-in support is native AOT friendly by default. So when you're using it in conjunction with minimal APIs, you get total native AOT compat across both your API experience and your OpenAPI experience.
We also have a bunch of attributes and extension methods and other means for you to add metadata to all the parts of your application, so you get that very rich OpenAPI document generated.
Yes, and if the metadata and the built-in inference that we use isn't enough, there is also support for OpenAPI transformers that allow you to modify the basic components of an OpenAPI document to your heart's content. We're going to be showing you all of that throughout this talk. So with that in mind, Mike, do you want to get started with this demo?
I will. So we'll start with generating OpenAPI documents. And what I want to start with first is to show you our documentation. And we've worked very hard on this. We think that this is going to be very helpful for you as you integrate generated OpenAPI documents into your workflow. So you can see here it's under the OpenAPI tab in the ASP.NET Core. You can see we're already updated to .NET 9. We already have our .NET 9 docs out. And I'll show you some parts of this documentation as we go through. I'll be demoing this with a little application that Safia has built that's called the Trainer API. And the Trainer API has a couple of resources that let you manipulate them or get them or update them, delete them. There's clients and trainers. So that's the application that we'll be using. So the first thing that we want to do is add OpenAPI document generation to this app. And if you go down here in the docs, you'll see that the first thing that you need to do is add a package called Microsoft ASP.NET Core OpenAPI to your application. And then you're going to add a few lines into the program.cs of your application. And so I'll flip up over here. We've actually already done this in this application. And you can see here that we have the package already in our CS proj. And in the program.cs, we have the add OpenAPI statement up here, adding the OpenAPI services into the web application builder. services collection, and then we have map OpenAPI. And map OpenAPI exposes an endpoint where the generated OpenAPI document is served. So let's see what this looks like. We're going to run the application. Now this is going to offer to open this in the browser, and we can click this, but something that I want to warn you about is I'm actually running in a dev container here. And when the dev container opens that link, it doesn't actually open it as localhost, which is where it needs to for proper core support. It opens it as 127.0.0.1. So I'm going to quickly flip this over here, and I'm going to go to localhost. Now what I'm showing here is the Scalar UI that we've integrated into our application. But before I go through that, let me show you what the generated OpenAPI looks like. You can see that this is at localhost of our application, OpenAPI/v1.json. And this is just a raw JSON output that is the OpenAPI document. You can see it's OpenAPI 3.1, and it's got all our paths listed here, the endpoints, and if I go down further, you'll see the schemas and such. Most people don't like looking at raw JSON, so let's go back and look at the nice UI. So here we have the UI. You can see that we have the client's endpoints here, and we have trainers' endpoints here. This is all nicely formatted. In part, this is because we've already added some of that OpenAPI metadata to this so that the clients and the trainers are separated out by tag. And if we come down here, we can see that we have this get a client interface, one of the client interfaces. It shows you what this looks like. It shows you what the responses are. And it has a test request option as well. So if you bring up that test request and you put in a path variable, which you need, you hit send. And that actually comes back with the response down here. So you can see that that's all live and hooked up. And you could test all of the endpoints in your application using a UI like this. And there are other UIs like this. We just happen to pick Scalar, but there's other options. And those options are all enabled because we're generating a standard OpenAPI document for you. Now, if we come back to Scalar and we close up the send request thing and we scroll down a little bit more, you can see that in the update client, we have this nice body that's described here with an ID that has a nice description, and we have the first name that not only has a description but says that it has a max length of 50 and it has a pattern that you have to follow and things like that. All those things are important things for your users to know when they're trying to use your API. So let me show you how those all get added. Coming back here, we'll come to our trainer API. And this is the APIs that we're exposing for trainers. And you can see that we've added extension methods to add things like the operation ID is added with a with name extension. And we add a summary, we can add a description, and we can even add descriptions on some of the parameters to the methods with this description attribute. So all these things are things that you can add on the operations. And then to show you the kinds of things that you can do on data, we'll come down here to trainer. And here we have our trainer class, which represents a trainer. And we have descriptions on each of these fields, the properties in the trainer. And we can have descriptions. We can put these other constraints on here, like max length and regular expression. You saw what those looked like in the generated documentation. This is where they came from. Now, one thing that I want to mention, this is a record, and we also declare the properties in the record separately. We do something a little bit different in the client class, client record. Here we're just declaring the parameters to the primary constructor. And when you do that, you can still add descriptions and you can still add all of the constraints, but you have to add this little property tag in front of the attribute so that it knows that it goes on the property and not on the parameter. So that's just a little warning for you. Okay, so now we've generated an OpenAPI document, we've viewed it in our UI, we can see how we add all this nice metadata. The last thing that I want to show you is how you actually generate at build time. And now I'm going to go back to the documentation. And we just come down here a little bit further, generate OpenAPI documents at build time. And there's another package that you will need here, Microsoft Extensions API Description Server. And again, we've already actually added that to the project. When you add that, by the way, with that .NET command, it adds this extra parameters to it. And then you can customize that with this property, OpenAPI Documents directory, to tell it where you want that document to be generated. And here we said we want it generated right in the project directory. And so that's where it got generated, right here. And here's the same file that we saw generated from the endpoint. And what I want to show you now is what you can do with that kind of file when it's sitting in your directory. You can do things like lint it with a linting tool called Spectral. So I've actually got a Spectral rule set here that I've created that checks standard OpenAPI things, but also checks for things like if all operations have a success response, if all operations have an error response, if all my parameters have a description. Do I have security schemes and response schema examples? And now you see that we actually have 4 problems. Clear filters. And what it's telling me is that my response body schemas should have an example, but they don't. Okay, so it shows me each of the occurrences of that. And it also shows me that I don't have security schemes defined for my OpenAPI document. And Safi is going to show how you can fix that.
Yes, Mike, I think I can help you out with that. Now, I'm using the same spectral linting tool in the CLI to check out the errors that you've observed with our OpenAPI document as it's currently being generated. So as you mentioned, there's 2 things going on. We don't have any examples for any of our schemas, and we don't have security schemes defined, even though there are endpoints in our application that require authorization in order to be accessed. So let's go ahead and try to fix that. And the way we're going to try to fix that is with OpenAPI transformers. So what's a transformer? A transformer is an implementation that can be applied onto the OpenAPI document to add, delete, or modify elements within that document. There are 3 kinds of transformers that we're going to talk about today: document transformers, operation transformers, and schema transformers. So if we take a look at the entry point for my application in my program CS, you'll see that I've made a little bit of a modification to the add OpenAPI call that Mike was talking about earlier. In this particular case, I have provided a callback to the add OpenAPI call that will make some invocations on our options object. Transformers in the built-in OpenAPI support can be registered into the options object in order to be applied into a document. And what I've done here is defined 2 extension methods: use job bearer authentication and use examples that will encapsulate the logic associated with my related transformers. So there we go. We've got it set up to where we can actually call these transformers and apply them in our code. But if I jump to my other file here, you'll see that I don't actually have anything implemented yet. So let's try to write some code to apply these transformations. The first one I'm going to take a look at is the use job bearer authentication transformer. Our application takes advantage of job bearer token-based authentication in its API. And in order to indicate this in my OpenAPI document, I need to do 2 things. First, I need to declare job bearer-based authentication as a security scheme that's supported by my API at the top level. The next thing I'm going to need to do is iterate through all of the routes in my application that might require authorization and indicate that in order to access them, somebody will need to provide some sort of token. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing I'm going to do is declare the OpenAPI security scheme that my API is taking advantage of. I've declared it here, OpenAPI security scheme, using the Microsoft OpenAPI library. We can see that it is an HTTP-based security scheme, which is how OpenAPI knows that it uses a bearer token authorization header. And the ID that I'm using is the default authentication scheme that ASP.NET Core uses for job bearer-based authentication. So I've got the scheme defined. Now I need to be able to reference that scheme both at the top level in my document and within the endpoints that require authorization. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to go in and invoke a method on my options object called addDocumentTransformer. And there's a couple of different ways that you can invoke the addDocumentTransformer API. The strategy that I'm going to show you here is the lambda-based pattern. I can pass an inline lambda to this method, and this lambda is going to take 3 different arguments. The first is going to be the document, which is the OpenAPI document that I want to modify. The second is going to be a context object, which contains some helpful information about the type of API that I'm interacting with. And the last is going to be a cancellation token that I could use for any APIs that I want to call within the body of my transformer that need it. So let's go ahead and declare that method signature. Okay, the next thing I want to do is actually implement the logic inside my transformer. And I've got that populated here. I'm going to go ahead and call into my doc schema. Sorry about that. There we go. Takes a while to figure out all the snippets that you need to access. But what this document transformer is going to go ahead and do is populate the top-level components element in my OpenAPI document, which contains references to properties that I might commonly refer to with the scheme that I generated using that same authentication scheme name that we declared as part of our default ASP.NET Core job bearer config. Cool. So now we've declared it at the top level in my document. The next thing we want to do is actually go through and iterate through all of the routes that are declared in my application and add that transformer or add that security requirement onto them if they so need it. And the way I'm going to do that is with the add operation transformer. Now, the add operation transformer has an API shape that is pretty similar to what you might see for the document transformer. It's going to take an operation, a context, and a cancellation token. And in the body of this transformer, I'm going to go ahead and use that context object to explore the endpoint metadata that's associated with my application and search for any APIs that might have an authorization attribute applied onto them, which indicates to me that we probably need auth here. And then go ahead and apply that security requirement onto the security property within that operation. So cool. I've used both the document transformer and the operation transformer to get set up with my security schemes for this application. So if I go ahead and build my application in the background, it'll go ahead and spin up that logic that Mike showed you earlier, which will generate the OpenAPI document at build time. And then we can go ahead and run the linter to verify that Spectral is no longer complaining about the lack of security schemes in my document. So let's hop back in to the view for Spectral, run the linter again on the document that's been generated, and now we see we've just got our examples to worry about. So let's go ahead and fix that part of our document. I've already got my useExamples extension method declared, but I haven't actually added the schema transformer that I need in order to be able to add those examples into the document. So let's go ahead and invoke it. And I'm going to do that with a slightly different syntax for registering transformers. Instead of passing a lambda inline to my add schema transformer, I'm actually going to pass an instance of the example schema transformer class, which I haven't implemented yet. This is another invocation pattern for transformers. Not only can you pass them inline with your lambda, you can also pass in a class. So let's go ahead and implement that example schema transformer method or class. Okay, I've popped in quite a bit of code here, but I want to draw your attention to a couple of key things. The first is that my schema transformer implements the OpenAPI schema transformer interface. This is the key interface that the Microsoft ASP.NET Core OpenAPI package will look at to understand if this should be a transformer that is applied onto schemas in the document. Now what I've done here is I have used a fake data generator to mock up some examples in my application. This is just a toy sample. In reality, we might want something that's a little bit more static. But here you can see I've used it to generate examples for clients, trainers, and the list of trainers that's returned by my trainers API. Now, I'm getting some complaints from C# that I don't actually implement the required transform async method that the OpenAPI schema transformer requires. So let's go ahead and implement that. The shape of this method looks pretty familiar. It takes the schema, a context, and a cancellation token. In this case, I'm using it to look up the examples that I've pre-populated in my examples dictionary based on some information I'm deriving from the context object. In this case, the context object for a schema transformer gives me information about the JSON type that that schema was derived from. So now I've got it set up to where I can apply that schema transformer onto my document. So if we're lucky, we'll run our build again. It will regenerate that training API JSON file, and we'll run Spectral. And huzzah, we've got no warnings. We've got a pretty darn perfect OpenAPI file.
Nice.
All of this with the magic of transformers, OpenAPI metadata, and built-in support. That was a lot, Mike.
You did it, though.
Yeah, we did it.
Well, all right, all right. So we've got a few resources for you. We've got a slide full of resources that we can show you on OpenAPI. The OpenAPI specification. In case you're not familiar with it, you can go there and see all the things that you can describe about your API using OpenAPI. A link to the Spectral linter that we showed you, a link to the Scalar UI that we showed you, and then there's a link to an OpenAPI tools directory which has all kinds of tools that use OpenAPI and you can use in your development workflows. In the middle section is links to all our docs on how to add OpenAPI metadata, on how to build your transformers and hook them into your app. There's a link to a section on using the OpenAPI docs that includes Spectral and other things, and a link to how to do that build time generation. And finally, we have some links on the .NET community. We've done some stand-ups, community stand-ups on this OpenAPI support in the past. You can go find that there, and of course, lots of other great content on .NET. And there's also an open source project called ASP.NET Core OpenAPI that's been developed by a community member that has lots of great examples in it. And in addition, Martin is also doing a talk on transformers later in .NET Conf.
Yeah, so definitely check that talk out by Martin Costello.
And if you don't have the slides, don't worry. There's a hot link at the bottom. There's an AKA link at the bottom that will take you to a page that has all of these links live for you.